glad you all, are we going? Cool, good. Okay, so I'm glad everybody was able to come today. Um, Especially, I know this is a busy time of the year, right? We're in the holiday season. Uh, what the heck does that even mean? I mean, most Americans probably think about the holiday season as being kind of starting the last day of work before Thanksgiving. It's probably kind of when that starts, and then runs through probably the first day you have to go back to work after New Year's is probably the way most people kind of think about the holiday season. Um, Obviously, that's in our culture. That's all built around Christmas, but most of the world's religious traditions have some sort of holiday this time of the year. Um, in the northern hemisphere, we all want to celebrate somehow in the midst of the bleak midwinter, right? To try to get ourselves through the cold and the dark, and it seems like it's not dawn until 9 a.m. or whatever. It's just dreary. And if there's one thing that tends to characterize this time of year, the holiday season, it's feasting, right? It's food, celebrating with good food. So maybe this is a good time to think about food and eating and our attitude toward those things, and kind of what does the Buddha Dharma say about that sort of stuff. So I actually want to start, I'm going to start with a little story. I got a little confession to make here. I'm going to tell you a story about a time that I said something that actually wasn't very nice. I had a work colleague once. He was a math professor. We got hired at the same time, but he was a little bit older than me. Our lives were really different, though, about as different as you could imagine. Among other things, he was an amateur bodybuilder, and I am incredibly not. So one aspect of that, though, for him was that he didn't eat. He took in. That was the language that he used around the food that he consumed. He didn't eat food, he took in food, because it was all very scientific, right? It was all very precise. He was measuring grams of this, that, and the other thing, and I almost always saw him with a shaker cup of protein drink in his hand more often than not. He was a lovely guy. I really liked him, but I have to admit, I was talking about him to somebody else at work one day, at the office, to a colleague, and I said, I certainly believe in healthy eating, but I really don't want to treat my body like a science fair project. It's a little funny, but it's a little mean too. And what I've realized in retrospect, though, is that in effect, life is a science fair project. And the only real question is whether we've assigned ourselves to the experimental group or the control group, depending on the choices that we make in life. Before we go any further, I want to do a little pop quiz. And this is going to be a weird pop quiz because it has nothing to do with Buddhism. It's actually about the Bible. I want to do a little pop quiz about the Bible. And it may seem completely out of context, but I promise you it makes sense. It'll make sense in a minute. So it does make sense. So just humor me for the moment. What I want to do is I'm going to give you the question. Think about it for a minute. I'm going to go 1, 2, 3, and want everybody to answer together, right? So we're going to see. And if you don't know, obviously that's fine. But let's just see who can play along here. So according to one of the letters attributed to Paul in the Bible, what is the root of all evil? 1, 2, 3.
Money.
Okay, that's what I was expecting. 1 Timothy 6, 9 through 11. For the love of money is the root of all evils, and some people in their desire to have it strayed from the faith and have pierced themselves with many pains. So it's not money. It's the love of money. Money is morally neutral. And in a modern society, it's pretty essential. You can't really get by without money. The sin, so to speak, in Christian terms, is in the craving for the thing, right? The desire for the thing, not the thing itself. So it's not money. It's the love of money, the craving for money, the desire for money. Now, you picked that because it's an example I feared would be familiar to at least a few folks. And if you look, again, look through the world's religious traditions, in any tradition you could find some example of something like that. It's a very common sort of a theme. Spiritual failure is attributed to the desire for things, not the thing itself. So if you think about food, food, like money, even more so than money, is morally neutral. Obviously, it's absolutely essential for life. You can't live without food, right? So let's think about food and kind of craving for food from that perspective. In a number of the Buddhist texts, if you look at the old Pali Suttas, if you look in the sutras, very explicitly in the what's called the Vinaya, the rules that the Buddha created for the monastic community, right? The rules that the monks and nuns have to follow and such. There are all kinds of statements of rules about what to eat or not eat, right? For example, monks were not allowed to eat meat if they knew or suspected that the animal had been killed specifically for them, right? If it was some family's leftovers that the animal hadn't been killed for the monastic, it had been killed for the family, and the family had eaten most of it, and there was some leftovers, and they gave it as alms or whatever, that meat was okay. But if the monk even suspected that the animal had been killed on their behalf, then they weren't supposed to eat the meat. There are also regulations about when to eat, right? For example, about rules about monastics only eating between dawn and noon. And then between noon and dawn the next day, you're not supposed to eat. And there are some Buddhist communities that still follow those kinds of rules. And then there are procedures for how to eat, such as some of you may have experienced this here at the temple. In Korean Buddhism, there's this ritual called barugongyang, the formal four-bowl ritual ceremony for eating. And there are variations of that in different forms of the Chan, Zen, Sun lineages. Or if you've read Thich Nhat Hanh, if you've read Thich Nhat Hanh, you might be familiar with Thich Nhat Hanh's idea of a mindful meal, eating in a very mindful sort of way. So again, that's a process, kind of a way of how to eat. But what I want you to think about today is why to eat or not eat. And obviously, again, we have to keep our bodies alive, right? And so we have to eat. And you may have heard the saying about how one should eat to live and not live to eat, right? The distinction there. So thinking about our motivations around eating, it's more subtle, obviously, than doing it or not doing it, because not doing it isn't an option. It's more about kind of the attitude that we have toward eating and food. That's kind of the bigger picture. The notion that eating is an important part of the Buddha Dharma, something that's as basic and everyday as eating, is really clear from the essential texts. For example, right in the Dhammapada, in the first chapter of the Dhammapada, there are a couple of verses. If you put your hands in Jaang, please, palm to palm, while I read these words from the Buddha. Just as a storm throws down a weak tree, so does Mara overpower the man who lives for the pursuit of pleasures, who is uncontrolled in his senses, immoderate in eating, indolent and dissipated. Just as a storm cannot prevail against a rocky mountain, so Mara can never overpower the man who lives meditating on the impurities, who is controlled in his senses, moderate in eating, and filled with faith and earnest effort. Thank you. Those were the words of the Buddha. Mara, in the Buddhist literature, if you're not familiar with that character, Mara is sort of like the devil. Mara is this tempter figure. One way to think about Mara is that it's sort of the personification of our own dark side, our own sort of internal shadow, sort of the worst aspect of ourselves, selfishness and hedonism and small-mindedness, that sort of thing. Now, I realized how much food and eating mattered in a really basic way on the Buddhist path of practice when I first started my training. My first formal experiences were at Zen Mountain Monastery, which is in the Japanese Soto tradition, so a little bit different tradition, but the same family, where I was really surprised. The first time I went there, I was really surprised to see there was an altar in the dining hall. Right at the front of the room, there was an altar in the dining hall. I'm pretty sure it was a statue of Manjushri Bodhisattva on that altar. And every meal started with a ritual at that altar, light the candles, light the incense, and breakfast and lunch, it was a more formal sort of a ceremony. Dinner was a little bit less so. But there was this gata, there was a chant, a prayer that everybody recited before the meal started. First, 72 laborers brought us this food. We should know how it comes to us. Second, as we receive this offering, we should consider whether our virtue and practice deserve it. Third, as we desire the natural order of mind to be free from clinging, we must be free from greed. Fourth, to support our life, we take this food. Fifth, to attain our way, we take this food. First, this food is for the three treasures. Second, it is for our teachers, parents, nation, and all sentient beings. Third, it is for all beings in the six worlds. Thus, we eat this food with everyone. We eat to stop all evil, to practice good, to save all sentient beings, and to accomplish our Buddha way. So to me at the time, and I'm new to this, right? New to this tradition. What were the main things that I kind of got out of that? And there were kind of two main takeaways for me. The first one was, rather than eating to not feel hungry or for kind of the sensual enjoyment of the experience of the taste and the flavor and the feeling and all that sort of thing, we eat to support our practice. If you think about what I said a minute ago, if we live for the sake of our practice, and if we eat to live, then we eat for the sake of our practice. That's just a nice little, like, college logic class syllogism there, right, to put those things together. The second takeaway I got from that chant is the idea of not eating only for ourselves. I mean, we put the food in our own mouths, and it goes down our own digestive system. But the suggestion here is that first we eat for the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. We eat with everyone, for everyone, and only for the self in the sense that the self is part of everyone. There's a similar gata prayer in the Korean tradition. It's a little pithier. It kind of gets to the point a little more clearly. We reflect on the effort that brought us this food and consider how it came to us. We reflect on our virtue and practice and whether we are worthy of this offering. We regard greed, anger, and ignorance as obstacles to freedom of mind. We regard this meal as medicine to sustain our lives. For the sake of enlightenment, we now receive this food. Now, the thing I love most about that one, and it was mentioned in the Japanese one, but it stands out a little bit more in this one, is the idea that every meal is an offering. That we are, in effect, consuming it on the Buddha's behalf. In order to empower our practice, and by doing that, we're advancing the Buddha's project of overcoming ignorance and suffering in the universe. So if food is essential to life, which obviously it is, and if eating can in fact be sanctified by dedicating it to the benefit of all beings and the Buddha Dharma, then we're back to that idea that eating is a danger when it is poorly motivated. Right? When desire and craving overwhelm our kind of more pure motivation. Ajahn Sumedho is an American-born monk. He's in the Thai tradition. He's one of the more important transmitters of the teachings of Ajahn Chah, who's a very, very respected master in the Thai forest monk tradition. Ajahn Sumedho wrote a book called A Handful of Leaves, and this is a passage from that book. What is desire? Kamatanna is very easy to understand. This kind of desire is wanting sense pleasures through the body or the other senses, and always seeking things to excite or please your senses. That is kamatanna. You can readily contemplate what is it like when you have desire for pleasure. For example, when you are eating, if you are hungry and the food tastes delicious, you can be aware of wanting to take another bite. Notice that feeling when you're tasting something pleasant and notice how you want more of it. Don't just believe this, try it out. Don't think you know it because it's been that way in the past. Try it out when you eat. Taste something delicious and see what happens. A desire arises for more. That is kamatanna. So pleasure, this is getting back to my Bible quiz, right? Pleasure in and of itself isn't bad. Just like money in and of itself isn't bad. But the problem is that pleasure tends to aggravate the craving for more pleasure. It's sort of a self-perpetuating thing. In many of the Pali Suttas, for example, the Buddha is portrayed as eating food, right? Food that's described as both coarse and fine, and allowing his followers to eat food that is both coarse and fine. And in some traditions, some translations, they use staple and non-staple for kind of making a distinction among two kinds of food. The texts aren't exactly clear on what qualifies as fine or non-staple food, but it does imply something that's nicer than your everyday fare, right? Holiday food, maybe. That's which, and everyday kind of food would be food that is coarse or staple food. So apparently the Buddha was not averse to eating nice food when it was available, when it was collected during the alms round, or when it was provided by a host. There are, however, rules for the monks and nuns preventing a monastic from asking for fine foods. So we're back again to that difference between experiencing pleasure and seeking out or desiring pleasure, right? If the monk is asking for, hey, have you got some nice food? That would be seeking out something pleasurable, desiring it. So maybe the most useful and important idea in all of this is that notion of thinking of food as medicine. Right? Remember that line from the Korean Gata, we regard this meal as medicine to sustain our lives. When Buddhism started in India, when it went north to China, there were a number of adaptations that were made, and some of them were around food. They were kind of regarding the regulations around eating and food. Partly that was a function of the fact that the tradition was going into a very different culture. Partly it was because of geography and climate. One of the adaptations concerned that rule that I mentioned earlier about not eating between noon and dawn of the next day. And when Buddhism got to China, there were several reasons why that kind of didn't work anymore. That kind of didn't make sense anymore. First of all, it's further north, which means that at certain times of the year, the amount of time that's between noon and dawn the next day is a long time. That would be a long time to not have any solid food every day, day in and day out. Another difference, obviously, is, again, being further north, it's colder. And to kind of get through the night without eating a meal in the evening and, your body have enough energy to make the warmth as mammals that we make for ourselves to keep ourselves warm, that would be really, really challenging. And then the other difference was that in India, the monks and nuns were able to depend on alms from the lay people, and they didn't really work. But then when Buddhism got to China, to support themselves, the monastics had to work, right? And it would be hard to work and be productive and only eat, between dawn and noon and not eat anything the rest of the day. You wouldn't have the energy to do the work that they needed to do to support their communities. So they needed that sustenance in the evening, but they approached the evening meal differently. In the Chinese tradition, for example, it's called the medicine meal. And it's much more low-key, it's less ceremonial, and you eat, again, you're not eating food, you're consuming medicine, right? For the sake of keeping your body healthy, you're consuming medicine. It looks like food on a plate, but it's medicine, it's not food in the same way. And so since Korean Buddhism got transmitted from China, the Korean lineage that this temple is a part of has kind of inherited that kind of approach to the evening meal. So that concept of food as medicine, even if you go right back to the very first kind of Buddhist story, if you go back to the story of the enlightenment of the Buddha, you can see that idea of food being medicine. It was the experience of eating a sustaining meal that led the Buddha to the notion of a middle way, right? Buddhism as a middle path, a middle way. The tradition says that Siddhartha spent 6 years engaging in these very severe ascetic practices. He got himself to the point, the stories say, of living on 1 grain of rice a day, which obviously is fanciful, but that's, gives you a sense of the depth of his ascetic practice. He was faint and near to the point of death from starvation when this young woman, Sujata, gave him a meal of, the tradition says, rice milk, which was just the medicine he needed to save his body. And it was that experience of eating, a moderate meal that led him to realize that the path that's both physically healthy and spiritually fruitful is this middle way between asceticism and indulgence. So as you go through the rest of the holiday season, try to keep this idea of food as medicine in mind. That doesn't mean don't eat a cookie or a piece of pie. By all means, eat a cookie, right? But as you do so, eat it reverently, right? Eat it in gratitude for everything that had to happen and all the living beings that were necessary in order for that food to be available to you. After all, as Carl Sagan said on the PBS show Cosmos, if you wish to make an apple pie from scratch, you must first invent the universe. And that may be the best statement ever of the idea of the interdependence of all things, right? To even have an apple pie requires the universe. And remember the other side of that interdependence too. As you eat, you're not only eating for yourself, right? You're eating to empower your practice. And the purpose of your bodhisattva practice is to save all beings. Thus, we eat this food with everyone. Sangbola Shipshio. May you, I, and all beings manifest enlightenment.